Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Revel, who is Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs and who wrote a comment piece for Conservative Home in August titled "Young People Socialising Made Nicola Sturgeon Want to Cry. If only Sturgeon got as upset over their debt burden." She asked who would be the champions of the younger generation. Also on the panel, we have film director and producer Sophie Sandor, whose documentaries explore socio-economic themes and who is formerly of this parish. Professor Len Shackleton is the IEA's Editorial and Research Fellow and Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. And also joining us, the Right Hon. Lord Willits, former MP and Minister for Universities and Science and President of the Resolution Foundation. Len, over to you.
Thanks, Annabelle. Hello, everybody. Well, there are a number of issues which we need to talk about. First is this idea of a generation something which is a meaningful category, or are there too many differences within a generation? Historically, we've concentrated on issues like class. More recently, we've looked at issues between men and women, between ethnic groupings and so forth. It's the idea of a homogenous generation, something which is really got much going for it. Then, of course, there's the issue of what exactly you mean by a generation. There's a lot of kind of pop sociology and stuff in magazines and the media and so on about all these different generations. In the last 25 years, we've had millennials, we've had Generation Z, we've had Generation Alpha and so forth. But really, biologically, a generation is the amount of time between being born and reproducing yourself. And so in modern conditions, it's probably about 25 years or so, maybe a little bit more, as we are delaying having children and so on. Now, if we think in those terms, a 25-year period, it means that baby boomers like myself, people entering the labour market today are two generations on from when I entered the labour markets in the early 1970s. And that type of time period, I think, is worth having a look at because there have been obviously enormous changes during that period. And today's young people entering the labour market face a number of, it's very different circumstances. Obviously, at the moment, we're concerned with COVID and the effects of the pandemic. But it's a very different group entering the labour market. Back in 1970, only about 7 or 8% of those entering the labour market had been to higher education. Today, the figure is over 40%. Back then, in 1970, less than 5% of the age group were from ethnic minorities, and today the figure is more like 25%. So there are huge differences over time, and those need exploring. Now, the reason why these big differences are of interest, of course, go back to this terrific book of Lord Willits, which my copy he actually signed, I see, in February 2010 when the book came out. And I've been looking at it again. It's a fascinating idea. And the subtitle is How the Baby Boomers Took Their Children's Future and Why They Should Give It Back. Well, now we're probably talking about they've chosen their grandchildren's, stolen their grandchildren's future. That's what I mean when I talk about this difference between 1970 and 2020. Now, one of the things which David was talking about in that book, and has been, the same ever since really, has been that maybe policies have tended to favour older people rather than younger people. One very obvious area, which the IEA has often commented on, is in planning and the restrictions on building new housing, which we hope we're going to see some change in. But that has undoubtedly had a negative effect on younger groups who have faced much higher prices for houses and much more difficult in entering the housing market. The other thing is the benefit system. And, I've got on my desk here, this is my notification of my winter fuel payment, right? Just previously got a notification about my £10 Christmas bonus, which was something which I think Keith Joseph gifted our generation nearly 50 years ago. Now this kind of thing is, it's a rather meaningless benefit, but it costs us about £2.5 billion a year, which could be spent arguably in better ways. But one note of caution about this, yes, with these kind of benefits and with the triple lock on pensions and so on, older people have benefited. But of course, these kind of very odd general give outs to whole generations are not confined to older people. I'm in a peculiar demographic because despite being an oldster, I've got young kids. And 2 years ago, I was effectively gifted £3,000 a year to put my youngest through nursery. And again, this totally indiscriminate benefit. And you wonder whether it's a general fault of policy that the government enters into things without really thinking them through in response to electoral concerns and so forth. And it's not a particular bias in favour of the old.
Emma, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Annabelle, and apologies to anyone who tuned in to see Maddie's thoughts on this. She's unavailable, but I'm happy to step in at last minute. So apologies if my introductory remarks are somewhat shorter than Len's, but I will do my best. I think now is a specifically crucial time to be talking about intergenerational inequality, because Len is right that there are very limited differences between a generation. If you're looking at a 25-year age span, I'm 28, nearly 29. The difference between how my life is going to go and the life of a current 3-year-old are astonishing. The difference between when I entered university in 2010, in certainly the very early years of the financial crash, and someone entering university now, they are only 10 years apart, and yet the amount of things that have happened that will influence people's careers, not just academic achievements, but how their job market that they enter when they leave university, and that's only 10 years. We're not looking at something as expansive as a generation. So I think it is important to break it down and not just pit the very old against the very young. But that said, coronavirus has very much exposed a difference between the way that different age groups are treated and different age groups are affected. When it comes to the way that coronavirus has been impacted for the young people, thankfully they are very, very unlikely to be impacted in a health way, but they are going to carry the financial burden of public sector borrowing, not just for their entire lives, but for the lives of their children, such as the scale of the debt crisis that we're having. And yet most of the public policy is being geared towards protecting the lives of older people. Now, that's not to say that's not a wrong decision, but public policy makers haven't taken, I don't think, a very nuanced view and looked at the impact of different age groups. We haven't looked at the impact, for example, of closing schools in Greenwich with 1 day's notice, closing schools in Wales. The impact that this is going to have on children is astonishing, and it is being done to protect primarily the lives of the elderly. But, we do need to be looking more at balance. And I think it's important, as I wrote in the Con Home article that Annabelle kindly mentioned in the introduction, I think that policies, when introduced by the government, should have a kind of assessment of intergenerational inequality. What will the impact be on the over 60s, on people of later working age, of younger people, and of very small children? Because, as Len mentioned, things like housing are seen purely are primarily driven by the benefit of homeowners who want to protect the value of their house, and not of people like me who are, if there's background noise, it's because I'm living in a rented house, with 5 or 6 housemates today. So, yeah, and it's also a very cold house. I could probably do with borrowing Len's winter fuel allowance, unfortunately, but that's not factored into the way we make policy. So I think policymakers should, at the heart of all their decisions, be looking at what is the intergenerational impact of this.
Thanks very much, Emma. Sophie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Intergenerational inequality is just another way of phrasing the fact that some policies disproportionately benefit the older generation, people a few decades older than me, and disproportionately make it more difficult for people my age to graduate into adulthood in the economic sense of that phrase. It's not surprising that this issue has arisen. We've come to focus on a lot of different ways that we should be pitted against each other, immutable characteristics, and your date of birth is just another one. So I think it's just another way of people in their 20s saying, poor me. Otherwise, the phrase is actually just quite meaningless. In many ways, people my age are more privileged than people a few decades older. And in fact, overall, we are more privileged because of the market, the inception of the internet, technology. So many more ways to create wealth have been introduced. And so I'd take this era over any other era. I was born into relative poverty in this country. Quite literally, we didn't have 2 pennies to rub together often. But yet, because of the education system, even if you go to one of the worst schools, you can still do really well because of the education system and what I mentioned, the inception of the internet, technology, the market. We are actually a lot more privileged, and it's very easy to point out loads of ways in which the older are treated basically as second-class citizens, because they're shut out of a lot of conversations because of the new language that people are expected to use. The job market is really oriented towards people who use the internet like it's second nature and who've grown up with learning how to use it. Of course, there are lots of policies, as I mentioned at the beginning of my opening remarks, that are disproportionately harming young people, such as the NIMBYism we see on the part of the older generation. They are supporting policies which make it more difficult to build houses. So I think that's really worth tackling if you're interested in policy and economics. And the same with the fact it's more difficult to save. We all know that if you're my age than it used to be because there's so little return. And coronavirus, of course, I agree with what Emma said about the education system, that there's not been a lot of talk about the bad impact that that's having. But again, we've been able to move online in a lot of instances. So because of the internet, overall, we are more advantaged. And the worst point about coronavirus impacting us is that we're going to be paying for this these humongous levels of borrowing. We're going to be paying for that. My generation is going to be paying with it for higher taxes. I'm an optimist, so I think that overall, I will reiterate, we're much better off than previous generations, even taking into account all of the things we don't have that boomers have, because what we value is so much less uniform. There's so many more ways to make it in life. It would have been quite sad a few decades ago to be 25, my age, and to not be living in my own house that I owned and have a child and living with my partner and married to my partner. That would have been very sad. But now most people my age who are trying to make it are very happy to have their online businesses or be working online. There's so many more things to be interested in and things to value in life than what boomers would have valued.
Great. Thank you very much, Sophie. Lord Willets, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join your panel, and thanks to Len in particular for the plug for my book, The Pinch, which was one of the first British books about intergenerational equity. And so let me try to respond to several of the points that have already been made. First of all, quite fairly, people are saying, so what is a generation and is it a useful concept? I think it is, because you can identify distinctive generations because of the way in which external effects hit them. So, for example, the circumstances in which you first enter the labour market, it does look as if there's quite a long-term scarring effect, depending on what the world was like when you first enter the jobs market. If you ask people of whatever age, what were the most significant political events in your life, they are disproportionately likely to mention something that happened between the ages of 18, when they were between the ages of 18 and 25. So it looks as if there's not just a labour market kind of imprinting scarring effect, there's also an attitudinal effect. And then, and this is the core argument in my book, The Pinch, I think it also matters how big your generation is, literally how many babies were born the same year as you. And the conventional view amongst demographers has been, which looks like common sense, that if given a choice between being born in a small generation with not many people your age or a big generation with lots of people your age, the obvious thing looked to be, we'll go for a small generation, less competition in the labour market, less competition for housing, travel through life, business class, not economy class. the core argument in the pinch is that actually the evidence is the other way round, and that being in a big generation works to your advantage. And that's because of insights which are absolutely associated with the IEA and things I first learned as a student reading my IEA pamphlets. First of all, in the market, if there's a lot of you, you have market power. You shape the market. There are a lot of consumers your age. That is why the Rolling Stones are still on tour. That's why Mini is still a car brand that people use. So there's a lot of you in the market. And secondly, there's a lot of you in the political marketplace. So for every person born between 1945 and 1965, which I regard as the baby boom, when we had a lot of babies born every year, it's still the case that there's approaching 600,000 people exactly your age who vote. If you're in a smaller subsequent generation, you'll be lucky if there's 450,000 of your age voting, and politicians pitch to where the voters are. So I think that both the modern market and modern democracy favors being born in a big cohort. Now, there's no sort of fixed official definition of a generation, and they vary. I tend to agree with Len. It's useful to think of them as 20, 25 years. I defined the baby boomers as born 1945 to 65. But to make this analysis rigorous, you can look at 5-year cohorts and just assemble data for every 5-year cohort from 1945 onwards, which is what we've tried to do at the Intergenerational Centre in Resolution Foundation. And you do find some very clear patterns. You find patterns in the jobs market, you find patterns in the welfare system, and you find patterns in assets. And although there are many other dimensions that matter, social class, ethnicity, gender, it does look as if when you were born and how big your cohort is a relevant factor. I guess for me, when you look at, and it's true, of course, going back to a point I think Emma made, that the wheels of modern capitalism continue to turn. It is true that for every generation, there's still technological innovation. And my parents had things that their parents didn't have. I had things my parents didn't have. And you guys in your 20s and 30s have got mobile phones throughout your life or something, but I can still remember their arrival. So it's true that that kind of technological advance continues to happen. Nevertheless, on many other metrics, things aren't getting better for the younger generation now when they used to, including, thinking of Emma's circumstances, things like physical living space. So the physical living space occupied by a young person housed in London today, partly because you are much more likely to be in private rented and much less likely to be an owner-occupier, you physically occupy less space than someone of your age would have lived in 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That seems to me a measure of something that is fundamentally going wrong with the housing market. Now, finally, because we must have a proper debate, for me, the indicators that matter most as a conservative who believes in property owning democracy is asset ownership. And it's absolutely clear that compared with the 80s and 90s, acquiring the two crucial assets of owning your own home and having property wealth in the form of a funded pension, those are much harder and of much less value for younger people now than they were in the past. So, and that is a clear measurable shift. And it's much harder out of your income to acquire these assets. And for me, the most important feature, the most important single statistic about the British political economy today compared with where it was 30 years ago is that 30 years ago, assets, wealth, was 3 times GDP. Now, assets, wealth, mainly houses and pensions, are 7 times GDP. And that is why the point where the rubber hits the road, the point where this becomes not just a statistic, but a personal reality, that is why saving out of your earnings to buy a house is so much harder than it used to be. And it also changes the characteristics of a society in a way that seems to me to be incompatible with the values of the IEA. Because, and here I'm simplifying, but imagine a society where there is no change in income inequality. There's no change in income inequality. And there's been a bit in Britain, but not much. And imagine a society where also there's been no change in asset inequality, the distribution of assets, though it is by and large the case that assets are more unevenly distributed than income. And in that society, assets surge relative to earnings. And although it doesn't show up as either a change in income inequality or a change in wealth inequality, it does make society feel very different, because assets and wealth matter more, incomes matter less, converting your income into assets gets harder, and inheritance matters more. And I think that's the society we're now in. You get wealth by inheriting it. It's harder to get it by earning it. And who your parents are matters more. And for young people who are not in a position to inherit, getting the assets that for my generation we took for granted, owning your own place and a funded pension, is much tougher. That is intergenerational unfairness.
Thank you very much, Lord Willets. Now, having said that, I would take the opportunity to ask the first question. I think tying into your comments there, I'd like to pose a question to Len that's come from an anonymous attendee. Isn't the real divide we're seeing now between those who have access to parental help and those who don't, particularly when it comes to buying a house?
Well, that must be the case, and that rather throws me back to the thing I started with: is are we really talking about intergenerational inequality or intra-generational inequality? Because quite clearly, people who have parents who are able to pass on wealth to them are in a better position than other people. But what is never clear to me from David's, I agree with David's analysis in a sense, but it's not clear to me what we're supposed to do about this. If we have insufficient housing for young people to get onto the ladder, what is actually suggested here? That we kind of take housing away from old people and give it to young people? I mean, what is actually the policy implications coming out of this? Going forward, I think we really do need, as Emma says, to look at new policies in light of this generational stuff. But it's not clear to me that there is some magic way of changing the results of 50, 60 years of the housing market being messed up by NIMBYs, as Sophie says, and so on. We have to try to move towards something which gives people better opportunities in the future, but it's not clear to me that there is any clear policy that we can adopt today to resolve this issue.
What impact is high housing costs having in terms of pushing young people leftwards? I mean, after all, I think most people attribute high housing costs to the market. They don't see it as a consequence of housing laws or NIMBYism. So their real first interaction with the market is through the housing market. That's their first interaction with the market economy. And if they're feeling ripped off, then that could shape their outlook on the market economy more broadly. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about that. But also, there is this sort of prevailing view that socialism is a phase. You go through it when you're young and you move rightwards as you get older. And the baby boomer generation, yes, people tended to start off more left wing and then became Thatcherites or Blairites. But do you think that trajectory is limited to this generation? I mean, I might start with Sophie and Emma there. You're millennials. Are your age mates moving to the right as we saw with the previous generation? And do you think, if not, that it's wrapped up in this kind of intergenerational feeling as though capitalism isn't working for you, high housing costs, feeling ripped off in your first interaction with the market economy?
Well, it makes sense in terms of this current situation economically for young people and for older people, and the policies that we've all discussed and brought up. It definitely makes sense that this could be why more young people are being pushed towards socialism, because getting rich seems to be more down to cosmic windfalls and who you're born into and who can pass on wealth down to you. So that's certainly one huge reason why, ironically, because if you're not socialist, you're more likely to think you can get on by your own efforts.
Emma, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with Sophie. I also think we're in a very strange situation, and I think I would say this, but I think it makes the work of people like the IEA even more important, is the point that Liz Truss makes, that people, especially young people, don't see the benefits of capitalism that they enjoy every single day. The fact that they have, a brand new iPhone in their pocket, the fact that they can use apps to get food delivered to their house. They can get a taxi delivered to come to their house, pick them up from an app on their phone. These are all benefits of market competition and capitalism, but they don't see those things as the benefits of capitalism. But what they do see is the downsides of corporatism usually, or NIMBYism, and attribute that to capitalism. So the things that go wrong for young people are attributed to capitalism, and the things that capitalism delivers are are not attributed to capitalism. So I think that is one of the things that will inevitably draw young people away and towards socialism. I think asking Sophie and I what our friendship groups agree if they're getting more right-wing than they're older, we're probably not the best people to ask as the employees of the IEA. I don't think our friendship groups are representative, but my brother, for example, is particularly left-wing. He's still a university student, and yeah, I think he would be more representative of young people than perhaps me and my friends. And yeah, for him it is certainly true that high housing costs, the fact that he isn't going to inherit a lot of money, but at Oxford University he sees a lot of his cohort who do have a lot of that privilege, that is pushing him further to the left. It's the inequality, as Len says, between between people in his cohort rather than older versus younger.
Sure, but I mean, a follow-on question from that, I think, to Sophie and Emma would be, why is it that your generation, which is also my generation, not engage in those issues that affect them? Why do you never see young people at a planning meeting, for instance? Why do you let the old NIMBYs monopolise the issue? I mean, is there an argument to be made that intergenerational inequality is actually, to a degree, young people's faults? They don't use their political muscle. They don't engage with in a political cause unless it's trendy and it can be put on Instagram. Sophie, what do you think?
Maybe it's just quite a middle class thing to engage in these issues. If you already have a house, then you've got the incentive to engage in the issues to do with housing. You have the time to commit to it. You have the money, the funding. Once you're younger, you have so many more issues to either be interested in, or the more fashionable ones, or you haven't. It's just a self-fulfilling cycle. It's an ongoing cycle, because as we're kept out of it, we don't have any skin in the game, and so we're not going to be engaged in it. What Emma said about it's so true that all of the benefits of capitalism are now completely seen as part of the furniture, which is very sad. I think we're the last ones who can remember life without it. I remember having a flip phone when I was 12, so that was pretty tough.
So Len, I'll come to you, on some of these issues. Working for a free market think tank, it's a little alarming, the notion that perhaps we won't see this move from socialism to capitalism, and supporting that ideology as people go through their lives. Do you think that younger generations will repeat the boomers' trajectory, or do you think it's something unique to your generation?
I don't think it's unique to my generation, if I accept that term. But one thing I would say is that I think we should attach a lot more importance to families than we appear to be doing in this discussion. I mean, most people had parents who loved them and looked after them, and most of today's generation of parents look after their children and love them. And there is a reciprocity between generations. Now, I know in David's book, he argues that we've kind of moved away a lot from that. But I do like the kind of Evan Burke type of idea of, you have a responsibility to successive, to people who came before you and people who came after you. I think it may, you can be pessimistic about this, but on the other hand, there are things such as, I spend far more time with my children than my parents, certainly my father, ever spent with me. I think parents are closer to their children than they have ever been, in a sense. And indeed, my grown-up son, I'm very close to him. We spend a lot of time together. We have the same interests in things. We like the same music. We dress the same. There are correspondences within the family which I think are there, and the idea that there's some kind of alienated generation who reject their parents and their grandparents and so on, I think is wrong at the micro level. I think there is a great deal of fellow feeling between the generations when we look at it in the family context.
David, I'd like to come back to you here just to respond to some of the points that have been made since the introductory remarks, and to get your thoughts on this perhaps changing ideology as you go through life, and whether you think we will indeed see this with the millennials as we did with boomers.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I do worry that, speaking as a conservative, that we do have have got a group of a large number of younger people for whom the promise of the market is not what it should be. And for me, as a conservative who believes in the property-owning democracy, it seems pretty obvious. Younger people are much less likely to be property owners, and much less likely to see the prospects of becoming property owners unless they inherit it. That is a bad environment for conservatives. On this issue of, well, we're all enjoying the benefits of continuing technological revolution, it's very interesting. If you look at the consumption figures, the surges in consumption, including the surges in things like eating out and access to online entertainments, is amongst the boomers, because boomers have got the money to spend. Because young people, because their wages have not really increased since the financial crash, and then they're increasing in the private rented sector, and where rents are high, consumption amongst younger people is lower than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So it's not a puzzle that they should be grateful for the achievements of a modern society, but somehow they're failing to spot it. It is not working for them. They're spending the money on rent, including 20% of boomers own a second property, which they're using to collect the rent from these young people. So there is a genuine issue of the living standards of young people have ceased to rise, if anything, are falling. Now, should they respond politically? Well, they could, and it might happen. When we try to work out voting behavior, a key factor in voting behavior is if you are in the private rented sector. If in the private rented sector, you're moving around more, it's harder to register. And the biggest single driver of young people not voting and not turning up is, as more and more of them in the private rented sector and in unstable accommodation and moving around, they are less, it is true, they're less likely actually to be voters. So they're both a small cohort and then disproportionately likely to be in the form of housing, which is least associated with being on the electoral register, which weakens their political power. On the family, I agree with Len, and this is where the modernist sociologists have been proved completely wrong. So their idea was that the family would shrivel and become insignificant. The opposite has happened, because we spend more of our lives segregated by age, working with people our own age, socializing with people our own age, in private rented accommodation shared with people our own age, like Emma. So there's less intergenerational mixing. However, meanwhile, the family structure changes the other way. Families are smaller, so we're less likely to have siblings. However, people live longer, so we're more likely to have grandparents and parents. So so you have a society where the sort of tall, thin bamboo of a family is the key intergenerational connection. The parents do emotionally, and I completely agree with Len, parents in many ways closer to their kids. They are, incidentally, also funding their kids. And it's very unwise to argue with your banker. So young people are dependent often on subsidies from their parents, and not just money, because they occupy so much less space, Emma. There's also the warehouse of mom and dad. So mom and dad even continue to hold a large amount of your possessions because you've got less space. So it's absolutely the case. A family relationship matters more. It's part of why inheritance matters more. You're closer to your parents, but you have fewer other relationships with people in a different generation. And as I say, I think if you believe in mobility, economic opportunity, the property-owning democracy, this peculiar combination of an age-stratified society with increasingly significant families is not what, when I was Emma's age and reading IA pamphlets, it was, and then worked for Margaret Thatcher, it was not the kind of society I thought we were going to create. And it is a problem.
So, Sophie, I'd like to come to you with a sort of more practical question, really, which is we're sort of skirting around the issue. We know that housing is such a problem. It's very, very difficult for young people to get on the housing ladder. It's very, very expensive. It may be that it isn't a political imperative, that the Conservative Party are not dependent on it for votes in order to win the next general election. But, let's say that the will was there. How would we reform housing policy to enable more young people to get on the ladder?
If it's not dependent on them winning more votes, then that's due to the sad fact that things have got so bad, and there's so much red tape, and the Conservatives have become so authoritarian that they couldn't lose any more votes than they already have. But policies, making it easier to build, that's the first obvious step. Making it easier to build houses, just stopping all of the barriers to these difficulties that policies have presented to my generation. All of these things in and of themselves are very worthwhile causes to oppose, and I'm certainly interested in doing it. So yeah, the older generation is also subsidised in many ways that the younger generation isn't, despite being the wealthiest section of society. So tackling housing would just be a huge way to solve so many problems. Where we live, especially in 2020, is a huge part of our lives.
So I'm just going to go to some of the questions that we've had from the audience, and thanks to those who have asked them. It says he isn't the most free market MP, but John Penrose wrote in his publication A Shining City Upon a Hill about delivering generational justice. Two topics were discussed: first, housing, and second, fiscal prudence. Out of the two, which area should we seek to prioritise when tackling intergenerational inequality, and why? Len, I'll come to you first.
I would say that the housing issue is probably the more important one. The fiscal prudence thing, there is debt, but of course, unlike say our massive debt during the Second World War, where a lot of it was owed to the United States, most of the borrowing which the government is undertaking at the moment in relation to COVID is actually funded by institutions within the UK. So what this debt amounts to is the next generation will be paying, it'll be paying in tax, but it'll be going to pension funds and things like that. The issue of fiscal prudence and fiscal equity is not as straightforward as it appears. It's not the case that the next generations are going to be in hock to some external and continually paying out resource to them. There'll be recycling funding within the UK to different groups. Now that may produce its own inequities, of course, but that can be adjusted through the tax system or whatever. So I wouldn't worry so much about the fiscal prudence aspect there. I would worry about the housing. And I think Sophie is quite right. We've got to liberalise housing. We've got to find ways of building more houses and perhaps repurposing existing space as well. The high street, we know, although I think your opinion is slightly different from mine, I think that the high street as we've known it is gone. And a lot of that kind of space within cities could be converted into quite reasonable housing in the way in which we've already done it. Warehouses and things in Manchester, for example, some fantastic apartments in Manchester from old warehouses. We can do this from shops as well. So we can repurpose housing and we should build more of it. And so I would focus on that.
Well, Len, you'll be pleased, or perhaps not, to hear that my enthusiasm and optimism for the survival of the high street is swiftly dissipating. I think I wrote an article in April saying it was too early to sound the death knell for the UK's high street, but with London potentially being plunged back into tier 3, as I say, I'm feeling less positive about its future. There's just one question I'd quite like to pose to Lord Willits. I'd like to really explore universities. Now, back in the summer, an IEA briefing paper authored by our head of education, Steve Davies, argued that COVID-19 is bursting a bubble in higher education, that the present difficulties that many many institutions face boil down to the fact that there's something really awry with the service that universities is offering. They're not really offering greater earnings later in life, or at least that's not what the evidence suggests, but rather a signal to employers about the sort of employee that you might be and the sort of attributes you might possess. Now, earlier this year, the Education Secretary abandoned Tony Blair's policy of sending 50% of young people to university. And I just wondered, Lord Willetts, what impact do you think this target might have had on young people's prospects, what you think about the abandonment of it, and how higher education could perhaps be reformed to boost prosperity and the prospects of the young in the future?
Yeah, I mean, Tony Blair set that target, but let's be clear, as a Conservative, I don't believe in targets. I think the number of people going to university should emerge from personal choice. So certainly from the coalition in 2010, there was no target. What happened, which again is very relevant from the IEA's view of the world, is lots of young people chose to go to university. And because we shifted the funding away from the state towards graduates repaying, at the same time, we removed number controls. So in the old days, there was a central control system in which the Quango, used to be HEFKI, allocated to each university the number of places they could have. And Durham would be told you can recruit 2,710, and if you recruit 2,711, you'll be fined. So what we did, which I continue to see as a pro-market reform, is we shifted the funding to graduates, and we got rid of a central control on the number of people going. And large numbers of young people went as a result. So it's not the case that they've gone because of some national target. They've gone because lots of young people wish to go. Now, will that change? I personally think if you look around the OECD, it's not quite a universal truth, but in almost every OECD country, in almost every year for the past 40 years, more people have gone to university than the year before. It seems to me to be a pretty deep-seated economic, social, and cultural change, and it's an appetite for more of education and more higher education. So I think trying to, for me, it would be very uncomfortable as a Tory to try to somehow be a sort of King Canute, stopping this incoming tide of young people who wish to go. I think when they surveyed the parents of children born in the millennium, 98% of parents wanted their kids to go to university. When I went round as a constituency MP, often on the mantelpiece, the photograph of the son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter in their graduation robes was up in pride of place. It was seen as a route to the middle class. I think it would be a really dangerous strategy for Conservatives to try to stop that trend. I see it as similar to aspiring to home ownership or aspiring to own a pension or aspiring to get married. Now, there are issues about how well it's delivered, and I see competition and information as a mechanism, but I think it would be a catastrophic strategic mistake if we get into the mindset that going to university is a bad thing and we must stop people trying to do it. And if I may rise to the earlier challenge from Len, which is a very fair one. So what are the policies? Well, I agree with, I think there's a consensus here that we've ended up over-protecting and over-regulating housing and planning, and that should be easier. On pensions, there's good news as well as bad. And the good news is that auto-enrollment does mean more young people have actually got a bit of money going into a pension. The trouble is that it's not much, and it's not going to pay much when they're older. But I personally think that governments, you could imagine taking the auto-enroll pension pot as the framework of a personal financial asset. I would be up for the government putting some more in, topping them up. I'd up for young people. Imagine they actually had more choice about how this asset was invested. And they could look around for commercial green investments and say that's how their money invested. Things that give young people, once again, a sense of ownership and the control over your life that comes from ownership is, I think, crucial for those of us who believe in capitalism. Capitalism without ownership is much harder to defend than capitalism with ownership.
Len, I'd like to come to you on that point. Are we on a runaway train, and it would be impossible to click into reverse when it comes to the 50% target? And as a professor at the University of Buckingham, what is your view on the future of higher education and how it can impact on young people's prospects?
I think possibly higher education may have overexpanded. It's not a view that makes me popular with other people in universities, but there's so much special pleading for universities, the belief that we're doing this wonderful education which is benefiting people and so on. I think, if you're interested in the kind of things which university teaches, you should certainly go there. But it shouldn't be seen just as some kind of inevitable rite of passage that everybody should go to university. And we should be thinking about different kinds of options. Despite the student loan system, we are subsidising higher education indirectly. And it may well be that a better way to think about this will be some kind of package of stuff which we give to young people when they reach the age of 18, which they can spend in different ways, either through university or through apprenticeships or through setting up their own businesses and so forth. And there should be rather more options on the table than the kind of automatic thing, well, I'm quite bright, I shall go to university, which we've all done. And I don't think many of us have regretted it, but it is something where I think we should offer more options than we currently do.
I've just got terrible feedback. Sorry, Emma. I'd like to come to you just on the general point of how we improve the lot of the young, if indeed this is something that's required. But we know that young people have been hit very hard by the pandemic, and I believe you covered some of these points in your Conservative Home piece. But could you perhaps shed a little light on what you would like to see change to ensure that the prospects of the young are improved?
I mean, I'd like to come in with some innovative and new ideas, but at the end of the day, it is housing. Housing is the one we should be focusing on. And I hate webinars where we all agree, but that it's just the fact that housing is the single biggest thing that can be done to improve the lives of young people. So I think one of the things that we've sort of alluded to briefly, but is the fact that young people are trapped in renting and shared accommodation is delaying, as Sophie mentioned at the beginning, sort of economic adulthood. People are not able to start families, and that leads into David's point of people having fewer children. People were having sort of very thin families, because actually, if you can't, if you're renting with 5 housemates until you're 30, you're probably not having kids at 24 like my mum did. We are pushing back the sort of age of economic adulthood because we're not able to tackle this problem. I think other things that need to be addressed probably are university a little bit. I disagree with David saying that, young people want to go to university. It's not a target, it's driven by what they want. I think that is true, but I think they want it because they have a belief that it will deliver benefits that we see. And as Steve points out in his report that you mentioned, university isn't delivering the benefits that young people think it will, because so many jobs require, you see on job adverts, it requires a 2-1 for no particular reason. Len is much better to talk about occupational licensing than me, but this sort of requirement for a degree means that young people have to go to university. As David mentioned, their parents prioritize, see great value in having a university degree because of the benefits that they think it delivers. But I don't think it does actually deliver those benefits. Len's right, I did go to university, but I don't think I regret it necessarily, but I definitely agree that it didn't deliver the benefits to me that I could have got from 3 years of doing something else. And I didn't know that when I was 18, and at 28, it's too late to change it. But I think we should be more open and honest about the benefits of other career routes, apprenticeships and that sort of thing. There are different ways for people to get into the job market. Sophie would be better to speak on the entrepreneurial attitude of the young people. Maybe we should be encouraging young people to set up their own businesses rather than spending 3 years at university, because it's not going to deliver the benefits that they think it will.
Sophie, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, sure. So again, there are lots of things that we need to tackle. I think we should be completely skeptical of the traditional measures of what makes us well off because of the changing environment that we live in. On degrees, I think, much like with the Oxfam Inequality Report each year, for example, it would put people like me in the poorest amongst the poorest in the world, because my debt from having attended university for a couple of years cancels out any wealth that I have, but I've built up human capital. And I think that kind of at first sight, it seems like these measures say something about how well off I am. With the Oxfam Inequality Report and modern day measures of inequality in the top 1% and the bottom people in the world, earnings-wise and wealth-wise, I mean, not earnings. It's the same with intergenerational inequality issues. So we're not as badly off as this whole concept, this new concept would have us believe. But nonetheless, it's always worth tackling these economic policies that are holding anyone back who's trying to get on today.
Len, I had a question. We've sort of looked back, but I just wanted to look forward briefly and ask a question about the impact that coronavirus might have on this debate, because I think the idea is that young people have been in some ways uniquely hard hit, economically speaking, of course, not in terms of their health, by COVID-19. There's this notion that older people are either retired and living off their pensions, or they're homeowners and they're sat in their gardens and having a boring but reasonably pleasant pandemic. And I just wondered if you could shed some light on the impact of coronavirus on the older generations.
Well, it comes back to my starting point, really. There are big differences within generations. And a lot of older people have been extremely lonely and isolated during this period. And the idea that they're sort of living it up at the expense of young people is a bit misleading. Some are, perhaps some are not. I have drawn attention in the past to the fact that we have been seeing a much larger proportion of older people continuing in work past the age. My father retired when he was 64. I'm still in harness. I'm not telling you how old I am, but I'm well over 64. I think older people should not be squeezed out of the labour market by some of the effects of COVID. Now, coming back to young people in this, I think it is worrying, and David spoke before of scarring and the effects on generations of being in a high unemployment situation. I'm a little bit more optimistic about this, because the fact that many young people have been working in bars, restaurants, shops, etc., and have lost their jobs, very often those weren't career jobs in the first place. And I think there is a great deal of flexibility among younger people. They've got a lot of skills which are going to be marketable in the future. And I think they will be able to adjust, assuming, that is, that this pandemic sort of peters out within the next year or so, and we can begin to get back to some kind of full employment situation. I think young people will be. But say, coming back to the older generation, we mustn't sort of neglect their contribution. We should not, as a result of all this stuff, go back to the idea that that older people should retire at the age of 60, 65 or something, and make space for young people. I think that's probably mistaken. We are going to have a lot more older people in the future, and we do need to ensure that they carry on working if they want to do so for as long as possible.
So I'll just finish with a question from an aspiring young student who asks, particularly to Lord Willits, what books he might recommend that they read, other than his, of course, in order to further educate themselves on the topic, but also would welcome recommendations from the other panelists. In fact, perhaps Len has written on this too. Lord Willits, I'll come to you first.
Do you mean the topic of intergenerational
Yes.
equity, or more widely? Yeah, I mean, the original classic article was a great philosopher, political philosopher, Karl Mannheim, who wrote an essay, The Problem of Generations, which was the first attempt to investigate the very issues that we began with. What is a generation? What makes a generation? Is it a useful term for social analysis? I've tried to set out the arguments on access to higher education and why that is part of this argument. And I think actually something we could do for younger people in my book, A University Education. If you look one more widely, we at Resolution Foundation produced a report on our intergenerational commission, which tried to tackle the challenge that, again, Len rightly put. So what are the policies that follow? And I think one uncomfortable policy, which I think is quite interesting for us on the sort of free market wing of politics, is for any given level of tax. So let's not talk about tax increases. Yes, say for any given level of tax, have we got the balance right between taxes on incomes and earnings and taxes on capital? And there was a strand of work, including a strand of work in the IEA, that a society where all the taxes are on income and the tax on capital is much lighter, given what has happened to the distribution of capital, is one where you'll end up finding younger people bearing a high proportion of the tax and older people who may not be in work, but who do have very substantial assets paying much less tax. So I do think, and we get into this, for any, as I say, it's not an argument about putting up taxes. For any given level of tax, there's a very interesting debate, which is just opening up about the right balance between income taxes and wealth taxes.
Len, would you like to respond to that question, after which I will wrap up?
Oh, I'm not very keen on wealth taxes. I think they deter people from saving. They encourage people to move abroad. You know, we should be very wary of going down that route, I think. There are ways in which we can make our income tax system more equitable. We should look at, I mean, one of the things I've been arguing recently, as you know, is this perennial idea of merging income tax and national insurance contributions to get a more equitable and a more visible form of personal taxation. Wealth tax, it's a slippery slope, really. Where do you draw the line on this? A lot of people have assets in terms of expensive houses that they live in, but they haven't got income on which to pay significant wealth taxes. So you're going to get all sorts of problems with that, I think. I wouldn't go down that road.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much to those who tuned in. We will, as I said at the start, be putting this on the IEA's YouTube channel towards the end of the week. We're actually posting 3 videos a week on YouTube at the moment, as well as creating podcasts, writing blogs, and of course, publishing cutting edge research. Professor Shackleton has a report out tomorrow on self-employment, in fact. This content is available for free, so please do consider making a donation to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'll make sure that that is put in the chat box. Lastly, a big thank you to our panelists, to Emma for stepping in at the last minute, to Sophie, to Len, and to Lord Willets. And again, thank you for tuning in, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Thanks.